Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our panelists for today. First, we have Dr. Nia Johnson, who's assistant professor of law at Wake Forest Law School. We have Judith Hawkins with us, who's a former judge and attorney in Tallahassee, Florida. We have Ms. Melissa Reed, who's with us, the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and Ms. Blair Marley, that's Director of Legal Corporate Counsel for a Fortune 500 company. Ladies, great having you here with us. Looking forward to the show. You know, there are many governments internationally that are also committed to religious freedom similar to the United States. The Jamaican government has been committing to uphold religious liberty at all times. There's a Minister of Legal and Constitutional Affairs by the name of Marlene Malahoo Forte, who has reiterated the constitutional safeguards for religious freedom, emphasizing that if the state enacts a general law within its power to advance secular goals, the statute remains valid despite any indirect burden on religious observance. You know, in a virtual presentation with the Religious Liberty Summit that was hosted by the Jamaica Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in collaboration with the National Religious Liberty Association, we find that the secretary or the minister has come back and said, however, if there is a situation that, quote unquote, may be similar to like a pandemic and causes us to have to infringe upon religious freedom, that may be necessary in a national interest. You know, Judge Hawkins, we are looking at this situation, and one of the things that everybody talked about during COVID, wasn't it amazing how quickly churches got shut down and we did not get a whole lot of pushback? And one of the questions that we all were thinking, is this a precursor to what we could see? And interestingly, in a country like Jamaica, which has a lot of religious groups and seems to be very religious, they've made it very clear that we want to make sure to protect religious freedom, but sometimes there are reasons that may come into fruition where we may have to step on it a little bit. Is that going in the wrong direction? Is that the right thing to do? Or is this something where it's probably going to be evolving depending on what's going on?
First, I have to ask the audience to indulge me because I almost feel like a law school professor. Let's start with some basics. She referred to a 2024 case that I was able to find, and the case is Freedom Come Ministries. And this case is an interesting case. I think this religious organization said that Jamaica's use of its laws during the COVID-19 epidemic was okay, but there were amendments made to their Disaster Risk Management Act. And so this case had a lot of constitutional issues that were just really ingrained in it. And basically, I think that what they were saying, the church was saying, was that when they amended that act, the Disaster Risk Management Act, they did so illegally and against the Constitution. I think that's really what the case was about. And so the church, or the religious organization, was making the argument that because of those amendments, it shut down their ability to run their church. They're like 10,000 membership around the world. And that the amendments put restrictions on how often they could meet, and it interfered with their ability to carry out their functions. I think that's put in plain English what this case is about, because I don't really know Jamaican law, but anyway. So when I read the opinion, there was a lot of talk about standing. There were a lot of references to the Constitution, a lot of language about how to amend their acts, so on and so forth. But the bottom line, which is most important, is that they said that, wherever I have it in my papers, what you said, that she said, the minister said, that they were going to protect the religious freedoms, but if there is something that rises to the level for the good of the nation, there's going to be a balancing act And I think the implications are, and that balance is going to fall on the side of the state, not the church. I think that's it in plain English. I think that's what that case is about. And in doing the research for that, I also wanted to tie it to American law. And so that takes us to the case out of New York, where the Jewish people, the Jewish congregation sued Governor Cuomo because he was passing some very restrictive laws under the pandemic protocol. And the interesting thing is that two other states had come before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had ruled with the state. And they make the observation that we now had a new justice, Justice Barrett, I think, was on the bench, and it was a complete different position where the church, the religious rights, superseded the state's rights to enact precautions to deal with the pandemic. I think I've laid that foundation out so that now we can talk about it.
You know, Blair, when you take a look at this, one of the things that seemed pretty clear from the minister is they said you can basically have all your religious freedom until we think it's unreasonable. And that's where it seems to get a little bit dicey as we start to look into some of these topics. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think, to echo the judge's sentiment, the minister noted that, one is able to manifest one's religious, ideas and beliefs with reasonable legal limitations. And that always gives me pause, right? And what she honed in to say was, particularly in a democratic society, for reasons relating to public safety, order, health, or morals. The morals piece is a little gray, right? We can really talk about public safety and health, and kind of get aligned on that. But objectively, morals vary from person to person, right? And it's your ethical stance. And so I know that in a lot of instances, what we see and what we find ourselves having issue with is the sense of whose morals trump here, right? Whose morals are going to be the ones that we're focusing on, and how do we determine a majority, right? In this instance, there are a lot of Seventh-day Adventists in Jamaica, and a lot of religious groups in Jamaica that kind of make it to their benefit to look at what religious groups may need. But how do you say this religious group is big enough to have their morals be what's at play here, but not the other ones? And that's very concerning to me. And so that's what I would be looking at.
I don't think this case really dealt so much with morals. It seemed to be just a practical case of they passed restrictions on how many people could meet, when they could meet. They even had, during the COVID-19 protocol, they also basically said you could only shop on Wednesdays and Fridays. And those had serious religious implications for non-Sunday worshiper Christians, okay? So I think this is just a basic case of we've got a pandemic. Jamaica wanted to take protocols to protect the people, and the state argued that their restrictions were not burdensome. I mean, they really were not burdensome, and that the religious organization's response was kind of, I think, out of proportion or out of perspective to what they did. I think that's what was going on in that case.
Well, I think what's important to also take into consideration here is that, when you live in a small space, right, where there are limited resources, and I think especially when you look at a country like Jamaica that due to colonialism is dependent on Western resources, and also due to their, distance from mainland in a number of different capacities, they also experience the ramifications of a pandemic differently, that, there are a number of things to balance here. And I think, Judge Hawkins is correct, but that's also a really important context, because on one hand, and there has been like a very good article that was written by Spectrum magazine a couple years ago during the pandemic, addressing the role of like conspiracy theory in space and how it creates faith-based environments can create a space where individuals are more prone to conspiracy theories and this kind of belief that God can trump all things, even though you are dealing with immediate collective ramifications. And so part of the social contract means that you do give up some of your rights to have the protection of the state. I had the opportunity to go to a number of different smaller Caribbean countries during the pandemic, or rather in the years to follow. And one of the things that they talked about were were hospitals being overrun and how they did not have the capacity to hold the number of people who were ill during the pandemic because of how often people were socializing, and also how little infrastructure they have there, which is a byproduct of colonialism. So, this is why it's always really challenging to talk about some of these things outside of a U.S. context. Because in the U.S., there are a ton of hospitals, right? There's a ton of doctors, right? You don't have to worry about the one specialist in your country leaving to go somewhere else. But when you talk about smaller nations, especially nations that are considered to be developing, this is something that can impact them quite greatly. And I think it's something that religious groups should work hard to be mindful of. As often as, it's important for religious groups to be able to adhere to their beliefs, that they are a part of a larger, I guess, like if we use a Christian terminology, a more earthly context that requires, loving your neighbor in some very specific ways that may not align with the way that you traditionally have done church.
I was just going to say, I really appreciated both the points that Nia and Blair made, the two different points. And one with Nia talking there about, really, if Jamaica is a nation that's filled with a lot of people of faith, particularly Christians, right? Wouldn't it be fantastic if we didn't have to make a law to say, hey, let's protect our neighbors, let's protect our communities, right? We didn't have to put these pandemic restrictions in. But we live in the real world, and so those sort of things exist, right? But that said, I really, what struck me was the same thing that struck Blair as far as the language of the Disaster Risk Management Act and how broad it was.
Yeah.
It went beyond, it went beyond public safety. It had the nebulous order. To protect order and morals. And then there was kind of like a blanket catch-all as well. And to me, that's really troubling because whenever the government is vague about something, then it's going to be misinterpreted depending on, the best interests of the community or even just a world view, right? And so that's why I appreciate precise language and targeted legislation. And I feel like this was overly broad. But again, I will go back to the point of it's really too bad that we have to have legislation to enact public safety to begin with.
Yeah.
So that now highlights why the religious organizations had so many constitutional issues
Absolutely.
in this case, because they were saying that the act was being amended and the amendments were circumventing their constitutional rights.
Absolutely. That's exactly the point. And Nia, one of the things that was really struck here was the fact that their constitution is so specific in certain ways that even trying to do something that you would say is in the betterment of the country and violating religious freedom, they almost had to rewrite the Constitution to be able to do something like that.
Yeah. And I mean, I try not to speak too much on Commonwealth law, right? Because I think this is something that a lot of folks in the West like to do, try to take our context and fold it onto another nation's context. There are reasons why certain constitutions are very specific and some are quite vague. And, there are pros and cons to both, designs and models of statecraft. But I do think, across the board, what's most important is that we keep in mind the different populations that are there and their different needs. An island has very different needs than like a landlocked environment. And that's something we should keep in context in the law.
I'll let that be the last word. But one of the interesting things about this is the idea that religious freedom is something that we look at as being, some policy that can be put in place. But in some countries, it is the foundation of their constitution. And the idea of any changes that take place could actually cause a country to have to completely restart over again how they put their rules and regulations in place. I saw an interesting set of circumstances where the D.C. Court of Appeals was putting a rule in place that would punish attorneys for representing certain religious clients. A new D.C. Court of Appeals rule was going to punish organizations like First Liberty and any other attorney or lawyers that were in our nation's capital that were going to be representing Americans with traditional religious beliefs. This proposed rule was going to expose attorneys' licenses in the district to professional discipline for conduct including speech that the lawyer reasonably should know is harassment or discrimination on the basis of a protected class. And the list of protected class includes sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, but it also includes an activity as it relates to religious freedom. You know, Nia, we now see the American Bar Association trying to push in and get involved. We see law firms now that are being told all over the country by new aspects of the administration who they can represent or who they cannot represent. But when you start telling someone what they can do from a legal standpoint as it relates to quote unquote free speech, which will include protection of religious freedom, it seems as though that may be a bridge too far, or is that simply what's going on? And somebody in law school today who's instructing students, I'm probably sure these issues kind of pop up.
Yeah, no, they do come up all the time. And I think what's important to take away from this is that, some of this is a quest for professional integrity, right? Unfortunately, for better or for worse, a lot of religious groups have aligned themselves with values that, given our Constitution in the United States, is considered discriminatory. And they also have preyed on in many different ways, the rights of marginalized groups. Now, this is something we talk about all the time and, on the show. How do we balance those interests? But I do think it's important to start from that place to understand how even, some sort of rule from the American Bar Association could show up in this capacity. There are some interests as a country that we do have, which is protecting people who maybe churches do not agree with. And something I do tend to bring up a lot on this show is that, churches, religious organizations do tend to lack a fair amount of restraint. And so people are looking for ways to protect folks who have historically been hurt by religious organizations. And I think that ends up being a byproduct. Now, mind you, the downside of this is that when you start establishing these type of very restrictive rules, you do inadvertently set a precedent, right? And so, these aren't necessarily laws per se. We're talking about American Bar Association policies, but those things can ricochet in other directions and give other leaders ideas, right? So that's where you have the Trump administration trying to promulgate regulations to bully law firms into who they can and cannot represent. And so I think this actually comes down on religious organizations to invoke their own sense of integrity without waiting for the government to give them parameters on how they should act. We know that First Liberty is an organization that has been funded not only by extremely conservative groups, which isn't necessarily bad or good, but they are, executing many different policies and laws and using their lobbying influence to restrict the rights of people in this country that are people, whether, religious organizations agree with them or not. It's questionable whether they support the separation of church and state, and those are constitutional issues. And so even though this was a policy that was designed to hold lawyers accountable to what they are taught in school, hold them accountable to what the Constitution also says, it's important to be mindful of where that could ricochet in the other direction. And in essence, you always need to be prepared for a backlash.
Orlin, you mentioned that this is actually mirroring something that is part of the American Bar Association misconduct code, and I know that there's been a national pushback with the ABA and the language that is used. Again, we talked about sort of overly broad language in our last segment, and I think that's the case here, and overly vague as far as what could actually be considered harassment. And so it was interesting. I was reading about this particular case, the District of Columbia case, and there's always a commenting period when new regulations are imposed. And according to what I read, the vast majority, so they received 52 comments during that time, and the vast majority of those were critical of this new language, right? That was, again, what I saw referred to as a speech code. One thing, the American legal system has not gotten everything right and certainly does not have a spotless history. But one thing that I really appreciate is that we have made sure that individuals receive representation, are always able to get representation. And so it's interesting now that we're looking at the agents of the court, right, lawyers, and we're actually restricting their rights. And to me, I think that's headed in the wrong direction. I do think that this is a byproduct of the culture wars that we're seeing right now. I think it's absolutely politically motivated, and I think we'll see that unfortunately continue to happen in other jurisdictions as long as we continue to be intolerant of other perspectives, both from a conservative standpoint or a progressive standpoint. So it'll be interesting to see what actually happens both there in DC, but also with the ABA.
I think that this is a PR nightmare for the legal profession. Regular people on the street, ordinary people on the street, are going to interpret this law like, what? You mean that I can't come before the court as a conservative or as a religious person and be able to articulate my concerns and have a fair, impartial court hear that? You're shutting me down before I even get to the courthouse steps? And I would dare say that when we hear how that's going to get spun, and it's not going to make the legal profession or the judiciary look very, it's not going to make them look good in the public's eyes. I mean, I just don't see how they're going to be able to do this without absolute pushback from the common man on the street or woman, common people on the street.
Blair, one of the things that's interesting here is that this kind of violates everything that you're kind of taught in law school about zealously representing your client, in whatever form you need to. It's almost like they're trying to take the punch out of what you can do even before you get into the courtroom, is what it appears.
Yeah, no, and that was my first thought, right? So as a lawyer who's barred in 2 states, I remember taking the oath to say I would represent my client, I would do my very best, I would be zealous, like you said, and you take that oath. And when you take it as a new lawyer, you take it very seriously. And hopefully throughout your entire career, right, you take it very seriously. And while the rule says that it's not meant to chill speech, is the exact wording that they use, I do think that it does, because as lawyers are rule followers by nature for the most part, right? And when you go in and you tell rule followers by nature, hey, you're not able to do this, they're going to restructure, or you get in trouble, right? You can get penalized. It can even lead to debarring of some lawyers, right? And discipline by the bar, which does not look great. You then restructure a lawyer's mindset and how they advocate for their clients, right? And while it's not meant to hurt First Amendment rights and speech, those rights, to Nia's point a little earlier, can be so vague as far as, what does that look like? What does that actually mean in this context, right? And so in this instance, I think what we have to do is look at some of the discriminatory practices that are trying to be pulled apart and trying to be analyzed, and look at that a bit closer and understand how lawyers can kind of navigate that treatment, because lawyers, hopefully by nature, in this idea of being rule followers, are also not discriminatory professionals, right? And so they will hopefully look at a way to look at this and pivot accordingly. Nevertheless, I do agree that it's going to be a nightmare. I agree that it's going to deter a lot of lawyers from representing certain religious clients. I believe that it's also going to deter a lot of lawyers from speaking up and using arguments and fact patterns to defend their clients that would naturally come to mind when acting zealously on behalf of your clients.
I'm just representing the common people on the street. I think that they're going to feel that they cannot get justice, that their lawyers' hands are tied, and that they have lost before they even come in. And I think the public, as it's spun, as it's presented to them, are not going to be able to do this level of analysis that we're doing here on this show, and there's going to be serious pushback.
No, and I definitely agree with that as well. The free speech ramifications are very, very strong. I think part of what is trying to happen here is that folks are thinking about, what does it mean when people are disingenuous lawyers, right? This is something that is talked about quite a bit within the profession. It's talked about quite a bit within the law and with legal academia as well, within scholarship. Of course, Judge Hawkins, not to say that the average person on the street is, reading legal academia, but this is something that as a profession, we talk about all the time, how folks use their position of authority as lawyers to push forward initiatives that are disingenuous, right? Now, we can say that this was overzealous, but I think it's also important that we understand the place from which this comes. And especially, thinking about this platform as a religious platform, there are many times where, unfortunately, religious groups do not take it upon themselves to consider other people. Right. It goes back to the point that Melissa made earlier. It's a lack of tolerance. It's the lack of tolerance that makes it so people think that, we can use disingenuous lawyering to push people in the religious direction that we desire to have. And that ultimately is not fair. And so I think we are, this is a PR disaster. I do agree. I think, if the right groups get their hands on it, we will definitely see a very upsetting spin. But this is also the same spin that folks gave to the CDC and the FDA when they were doing their jobs, right? Anything can be spun in the direction of a bad actor. Anybody can spin anything to suit their interests. And I think that still matters too.
Arlen, I think that this rule could absolutely be misused to target disfavored speech from any sort of political spectrum.
Yep.
And it's certainly concerning to me. I would say that, we are in this climate, right, where, again, Nia and I are both talking about this intolerance that we're seeing from various population groups. The way to change hearts and minds is not by muzzling people's ability to speak. That's not going to, and is that our ultimate goal, for us to be able to, come to a place of compassion and treating people with dignity? Absolutely. That's I certainly hope that is our goal as a nation. And the way to do that is not by forcing people not to be able to view their perspective.
I also think there's an issue with discrimination, right? And I think we've seen it time and time again with this administration, is trying to redefine discrimination and what that looks like, and trying to take a more narrowly tailored approach to that, right, to serve their best interests. And I think that the problem there with that is religions, unfortunately, have a history of being very biased and being, especially in the Christian religion and the denominations that follow that religion, for being very discriminatory and having a lot of biases there, right? And then passing those off as, a matter of following God, a matter of following Christ. And I think that while this does call into question a lot of the ethical rules that lawyers will have to follow, it also calls into question what Christians are doing across the board.
I don't have to let that be the last word, but, as somebody who practiced law in D.C. for a number of years and has watched a lot of activity in Washington, even from a political standpoint, the idea of trying to put something in place that's supposed to set a good decorum for attorneys in D.C., don't think this is going to get you there. Hey, Judge Hawkins, tell me something I don't know.
I hope that you don't know that the Jamaica flag is one of the two in the entire world that does not have the colors red, white, and blue incorporated.
Blair, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know that with a ratio of one Adventist person per 12 people in Jamaica, there are more than 307,000 Adventist church members on the island?
Wow. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
All right, Orlin, we're talking about lawyers. Did you know that according to the ABA, there are reports of 1.3 million active attorneys in the United States? We're keeping them busy, too.
Nia Johnson, tell me something I don't know.
So, I love to talk about healthcare on here. So did you know that multiple polling outlets, including Kaiser Family Foundation and the University of Michigan, have said that most Americans cannot distinguish what is medical misinformation from good information?
Wow. Thanks for that information. Great topics and great discussion for today. And thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.